It is time to review Rise of the Powers of My Balls #1 from Kieran Gillen, R.B. Silva, quite possibly the dumbest named comic book in the history of the world, Stock.
Remember back when Jonathan Hickman wrote a thing that you actually wanted to read? Well, this is our really pale imitation of a sequel to it.
Now, I'm not going to lie here, Doc. The beginning of this comic book I find particularly rough, and obviously we'll get to the details. But I thought by the end, Kieran Gillen and R.B. Silva kind of brought it home. You know, Fall of the House of X was just a disaster, in my opinion. But this is kind of a pretty damn good comic book.
It's not a bad comic book, especially compared to the Fall of My Balls of X. I'll say this was, I think, the best that Kieran Gillen can do with his relatively limited ability in storytelling. He was aiming for the fences here, especially with high concept stuff. And he just fell short because he's really not smart enough to execute.
I think by the end of this conversation that you and I are going to have, your mind is going to be changing. You'll be singing the praises of Kieran Gillen, at least for some parts of this book. Let's get right into it, because I do think R.B. Silva dialed it up here with the art and the creativity. He is working with some very high concepts. We're working with dominions and ascension and moving out of space and time. And I think he kind of nailed the aesthetics of it. And it is a very exciting comic book to look at, especially after the first 10 pages or so.
R.B. Silva's art here was pretty good. The problem was, I think, in the concepts here, it was big concept. It was dominions and time and operating inside and outside of time and in different time periods and all this shit that was almost conceptual in its nature, and his attempts at rendering it onto the page, both in storytelling from Kieran Gillen and art by R.B. Silva, it ended up making it a little nonsensical.
Is it completely clear what's going on at all times? Absolutely not. And I will admit that one. But I do think by the end, the writer, Kieran Gillen, nails this one. Now, at the beginning, as I said, it is a rough journey at the beginning, because when we read this new final form of the X-Men team, it is one of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen. It's 10 years in the future. They are stranded on the Sword space platform. It looks like it's not functioning correctly anymore. And instead of Professor X, we have Sync as Professor X because he stole his abilities, and conceivably Professor X died. We have an AI version of Tony Stark. Never seen that one before. We've got Captain Krakoa is the final form of Kamala Khan. Kate Pryde becomes Shadow Tiger because she ate the dead seed and became a giant zombie or something. And then we just have a normal version of Wolverine, which is definitely the highlight of all this stuff. But when I saw this team, I will admit, I was like, I don't see this going anywhere good, because this is one of the more embarrassing X-Men teams I've ever seen in my life.
It really is. I mean, you have a face-covered version of Superior Iron Man going back to the Axis era, but I don't see how it belongs anywhere near an X team, especially an X team that's fighting against AI, but you have an AI team member. Okay, fine, whatever. Let's move past that. Flower-headed Captain Krakoa, Kamala Khan. They need to find a way to shoehorn her in here. You know that she's going to be absolutely central to the X-Men for the next 15 years while they try to get her over for the 14th time. Wolverine, yeah, you know, he makes sense. Cool. I'm good with that. Shadow Tiger here, you know, I want to hate it, but it's not the worst thing. It kind of feels a little bit inspired by both Days of Future Past, the comic, and Days of Future Past, the movie. And after her essential power up here through the Death Seed, her ability that they cover a little later to phase not only through objects, but also through time and space. So while it is a little cringy, I kind of like that.
I was not a fan of this team outside of Logan myself, but the good thing is, Doc, they are on their last mission. They've got to stop the ascension of Nimrod and Omega Sentinel and Dr. Stasis and whoever else is associated with this post-humanity existence on Earth, because they want to ascend up into the Dominion. They finally have acquired like the necessary knowledge and technology to be accepted, I believe, into the Dominion, and they are on a quest. They need to find this hidden person that they know that they have in some type of vault but they also need to stop Stasis from uploading and all this kind of stuff. And we basically get to watch Nimrod kill them all, other than Logan. And I was like, yeah, I kind of like this.
Yeah, I kind of didn't mind it either. They're trying to do this thing with turning Arakko or Mars into a world mind. Then Nimrod kills all the rest of them. It doesn't really entirely make sense on why he would want to remove them from the equation, but fuck it, whatever. This is, again, I think, part of the things in here that where Kieran Gillen was reaching for very, very high concept and is just not a good enough writer to make it work. This is where it started getting nonsensical.
I think the problem with this comic book, Doc, they should have been setting this up for the last year or two in multiple books, because when it happens, it's exciting, but it is confusing.
Hawks and Pox needed to be, all the intervening series that have been published between then and now needed to be building towards this. That was the goal of it. That was the design of it. But instead, they didn't bother to build to any of these stories. They spent 4 years dicking around and doing nothing. This is what the whole point of the Krakoan era should have been building towards, and they didn't. They didn't set up a fucking bit of this, except for in a couple issues of Immortal X-Men, when they weren't otherwise dragging that fucking book into one of the 19 different X events for the last couple of years.
I agree with all those criticisms. And they have highlighted Mr. Sinister very heavily. I think there's 4 versions or 4 clones of Sinister, and there's one real one. And we know Sinister became like an AI, I believe, in the last issue of Immortal X-Men. And when we see like his ultimate plan, because they do try to stop him, they almost do. They find, I think, the original Sinister, Wolverine kills him because he's a backup. And then we have, I think, Rasputin the Fourth or whatever her name is. She tries to kill Stasis before he can upload and sync up with the Dominion or whatever, but it's too late. It's already happened. And it turns out this was all Sinister's plan the whole time, because he wanted to become an AI god. And it made so much sense for the character. He seems like he's just evil enough to think this was a good idea.
It's all the machinations of one Sinister versus the other 4, and all of them versus each other. And this is when it starts getting a little nonsensical. You have Nathan Essex, who's doesn't exist, who's an idea at this point, and Stasis, who ends up running down to the Children of the Vault because he's been working on this thing the entire time as well, that is somehow separate from the one that he was also working on with another Sinister and Orcus. So every Sinister has their own attempts at building a AI world mind dominion thing in order to create a black hole. And this is where you start getting into the weird Jonathan Hickman attempts at copying by far less talented creators, because you end up with a world mine and a giant black hole and a singularity that starts on Mars, and it looks like it's going to suck the Earth into it. But then you also have the other one, the Stasis one, that was doing the one with the Children of the Vault, that he then teleports that singularity into the sun, and that one starts fighting with the other, and it's just black holes shooting laser beams at each other that don't make sense, because lasers are forms of light and dominions are black holes, and you can't let light escape from a black hole. This is what I mean when you get into far less talented and far less smart creators trying to ape on somebody else's stuff.
While Kieran Gillen does try his hardest, and it is a bit nonsensical, there actually has to be a couple of additional data pages at the end just to kind of fill in some of the blanks on how any of this kind of works, because in the storytelling itself, the visual storytelling, the narration, the conversation, none of that is apparent because he wasn't able to get the idea out there fully.
You got to have this whole battlefield of the rise of the powers of X. Jesus fucking Christ. There's the Stasis timeline, the Sinister timeline, the Orbis timeline, which I have no fucking clue what that is. Then now, which is the Enigma coming online, there's the Omega Sentinel's original timeline, all connecting to some Moira engine that's back on fucking Krakoa that somehow connects to the other Moira 9 lives. And then outside of time and space, you have the Enigma and you have the white hot room and you have No Place X. You either have made far too high concept of a comic or you're too dumb to make it. One of the two.
But it was very exciting because I was like, hey, this is all tying into that Powers of 10 type of stuff, obviously with a few tweaks here and there. So I did like that. And I thought it was perfectly fine at this point, Doc. I don't know that I was going to recommend the comic book at this point, but I was happy with it. But when we get the final reveal, where the Moira engine plays out in all of this, in the No Place, we've got Professor X, Rasputin the Fourth, Doug Ramsey, all sitting in there, and apparently they're simulating all these things using the Moira engine and realizing that Enigma has figured out how to become the Dominion, and there's only one way to make this not happen. And I thought this was fucking brilliant, Doc. This was the best creative decision I've ever seen in my life. This is not only touching into what Jonathan Hickman was doing with Powers of 10 and paying tribute to that, but also paying tribute to the last 5 years of X-Men storytelling in the Krakoan era, when the X-Men have been nothing but absolute fucking villains. And they realized the only way to avoid this is to go back in time and kill a kid. And I was like, finally, Professor X has realized and accepted the fact that he is the most villainous fucking person in the history of the X-Men. He's going to go back and kill children, Doc. I thought it was just fucking chef's kiss, brilliant way to encapsulate just how evil these people are.
I've been saying for a while that this whole thing is so fucked, the only way to unfuck it is to undo it completely and it never to have happened, been able to have happened. I hope to God they do go down this road.
It's the only ending that would make sense for the story we've been reading. They have to accept that they are the ultimate villains in the universe.
Killing babies is bad, but it's that whole go back in time and kill baby Hitler. Does it make the world a better place? Blah, blah, blah. Is there an excuse for doing a villainous thing for virtuous reasons? I think the problem is that they've gone so far down that slippery slope to villainy and to complete moral ambiguity throughout this entire era of X-Men that the only way out is by one more villainous thing so that none of it ever happened.
And I just thought it was a fantastic tribute, not only acknowledging what Jonathan Hickman was setting up. Obviously, it's not exactly what Hickman was going to do, following through with that, but also the ultimate acknowledgement by the end that Charles Xavier was the bad guy in there. The Chris Claremont Charles Xavier, the Stan Lee Charles Xavier, the Scott Lobdell Charles Xavier would never kill a kid. But we're at that point in time with the character where this one would absolutely do it. And I think it's a wonderful tribute to what they've built over the last 5 years. I just couldn't imagine anything exemplifying it better than that.
No, it really doesn't, because it's just saying, yep, we're coming to the realization that we have made these characters into utterly morally reprehensible funhouse mirror versions of themselves. It's an acknowledgement. We've reached the point where the only way out of this is through it. And that's by making them absolutely, completely horrendous villains so that it can reset itself.
Yeah, so, it was a roller coaster of a comic book, but it was always going up. The beginning, when they introduced that team, I was like, this is embarrassing. We get into the Ascension stuff with the Dominion and the Sinisters and all that stuff. I was like, this is a little bit more interesting. I'm a little confused here, but I'm enjoying this a lot more. And I do think R.B. Silva upped his game a little bit on the art. But when we got the final reveal of what their final solution was, I was just like, bravo, chef's kiss. This is how you do it. And this is the fitting end that the X-Men deserve. That
is absolutely the fitting ending that the X-Men would deserve. But here's the thing. I know that it's Kieran Gillen. I know that it's Jerry Duggan. I know that it is Ukulele Boy. And the rest of the legion of doofuses in that fucking office. Because of that, they will swerve away from it and they won't actually do it. And they'll try to find a way to. I know that they have to. I'm telling you they won't, because I know who these fucking retards are.
Well, they better land it there, Doc. Now, you and I have great discussions. Obviously, we talked about the Eisners. We've done this review. We're going to do the Q&A. But I also have a couple of other podcasts out there. If you like the reviews, I do another review on Patreon, but I also do a 2-hour podcast with Jim where we talk about all the brand new comic books of the week from DC, Marvel, indie comic books. And I can't do this with you, Doc, because you don't read new comic books.
I don't read new comic books anymore unless you've assigned them to me.
So if you want more full coverage of new comic books every week, go check out the Patreon. We do some really great stuff there, especially the Hot or Not show with Jim. There's a link in the video description. Obviously, you get more Doc than you can handle.
Well, yeah, you'll always get way too much of me.